Today's scripture comes from Luke chapter 9, verses 28 to 36, and it describes a mountaintop experience that Jesus had with his innermost circle of disciples. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face was changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then, from the cloud, came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one of the things they had seen. Well, there's a lot to unpack just in these few verses. Have you ever had what I would call a mountaintop spiritual experience, a time where you sensed the presence of God, or even heard perhaps God speaking to you, whether that was in an audible voice or inside your head or internally? You just knew that you had heard from God or sensed God's presence. I'm fortunate to be able to say that I have a number of times, and I hope you have too. Not as significant as what Jesus experienced. Here he is accompanied by Moses, who represents the law and the giver of the Torah and the first great leader for Israel, and Elijah, perhaps the first and the greatest of the prophets, the one who was to come before the Messiah to prepare his way. And poor Peter, who's there with James and John, and those 3 make up Jesus' innermost circle. He has the 3, the 12, the 70, 120 who surround him. That's the leadership structure of Jesus' movement. And these 3 are overwhelmed. James and John don't say anything. Peter says, "Hey, let's build some tents or dwellings so you guys can stay." Because there's often that sense when we have a mountaintop experience that we want it to last. And we don't want to leave. We don't want to go back to life in the valley, if you will. But that's not what we're called to do. We're called to take those mountaintop experiences where we sense God's presence and God's voice, and let that give us the power and the faith we need to go forward this day. I pray God will give you faith and confidence, and that you'll sense the Lord's nearness today.